So, welcome, Rosie, and thank you so much for being here. Just to give a little bit of context, and I suppose just to remind us. So, the reason I found you, Rosie, was because a coach had put on LinkedIn a review of your book, The Magic Happens in the Silence. And a colleague of mine who knows about the thinking environment posted in there, Sophie, what do you think of this? And I was like, well, I don't know. I haven't read the book. So I probably got the book, read it, and then reached out to you, didn't I? And then you very kindly had a conversation. And after that conversation, I thought it'd be so lovely to actually have a more in-depth conversation that we could share, because I think my first thought when I first picked up your book, Rosie, was like on the surface, it's quite different to a thinking environment. Um, and yet, actually, when I reread it and when I went back in, it's not, you know. And I think there's so much relevance and resonance in the book for people who are beginning on their coaching journey, but also some experienced practitioners. And so I thought it'd just be really nice for us to have a conversation and think a little bit together about some of the themes in your work. But maybe if you just wanted to introduce yourself, that would be lovely too.
Yeah, well, firstly, thank you so much for reaching out, and I'm really delighted to be here and looking forward to our conversation today. So I am a coach and a trainer of coaches. So I spend a lot of my time training coaches, new coaches, and developing coaches, both as independent coaches and also in organizations, helping leaders and managers adopt a coaching approach to their relationships with their people, and helping organizations build a coaching culture. My background, I years ago worked for British Airways, so I joined their graduate program many years ago, loved working for BA, and some of the people I work with still are people I work with back at British Airways. We're sort of all out of the same stable, think and work in a similar way. And then I left BA when I started to have my family, and became an independent consultant and worked a lot in leadership. And coaching gradually came onto my radar and then came up and up my agenda. And I became more and more passionate about coaching. The more I looked into it, the more I studied it. And so now what I love to do is to integrate coaching into leadership, and look at how a really effective leader can use coaching in the way that they become a leader and a manager. And I spend a lot of time coaching, but also training and developing coaches. And that's where the book came from.
Yeah, so maybe just share so again, I mean, even the title of the book is really captivating, but so maybe just share, like, how did you get to the stage where you knew what you wanted to put in the book?
Yeah,
getting there is quite a journey, I think, in itself.
It is. Yes, it is. So the book came from the courses that we run to train new coaches, and we used established coaching models as a framework to help new coaches learn how to structure a coaching conversation. And we used to use the GROW model, which is a fantastic coaching model, probably the widest used coaching model in the world. And we used that, and what we created was a framework of coaching questions. So the GROW model, the goal, reality, options, and will, we gave people 4 questions around the goal, 4 questions around reality, 4 around the options, and 4 around the will. So it was like a 16 question, almost like a script, so that when people did their very first coaching conversation and they were quite nervous about it, we said, just ask these questions and it'll guide you through the process and it'll familiarize you with the process. And we did that because we found that if we didn't do that, people would start asking questions and then go off at tangents and have a lovely chat, but it wasn't really a coaching conversation. So the coaching script was really popular, and it worked really well. And we just used it at the very beginning. And then we said to people, now use that with a light touch and then start to develop your own style and respond to the direction of the coachee. But what people would say is, what if I haven't got a goal? I don't know what my goal is. And so starting with a goal, and most coaching models that you find, most of the established ones, start with a goal or an objective. And people would often say, but I haven't got a goal. That's why I'm here. I'm stuck. I don't know what I want to achieve. So I started playing around with a different structure and a different order. And what we found, what people want is they want to talk about where they are now. And they said, you won't understand my goal until you understand my current situation. And actually, I don't think I even understand my current situation properly. So what I'd really like to look at is why do I feel confused or a bit unhappy or a bit stuck? I'm not quite sure. I'd really like to talk through why I feel like I feel and examine how did I get to where I am now and is it right for me? So it was like looking in a mirror. And so we used to have, back in when we did everything face to face, we would have a physical mirror and we would hold up this mirror and say, what we're going to do for you is help you look in this mirror. So we would hold the mirror up and we're going to say, we're going to hold the mirror up and tell you, what do you see when you look in the mirror? And that's where the concept came from. And so we started to develop a different model. And that's where, that's the initial start of the book, is starting to develop the coaching model. That came first. The magic coaching model came first and the book came afterwards.
Yeah, and I love that, Rose, because in some ways I think, so obviously in a thinking environment, we'd never start with goals.
Yes.
Because, just as you're saying, I think that the ability to actually work out what we want, or what we want to feel, or what we want to do, or how we don't want to feel, that actually comes quite a long way down the process. But actually to work that out is actually, I would say, like, that's 80% of the work, isn't it? Like, actually working out, and I think often in coaching, when you do start just with, it's like, well, what's the goal? I just think we miss the treasure, and actually the depth or the quality of that goal is then compromised because it tends to just be on the surface. Like if I tell this is my goal and it's the first thing I've thought of, but actually the goal I really want is down here. And that process of allowing time and space to really think about it, we've, I suppose, found that actually then when we are ready to work out what we most want, it's much easier to think about. And we're more in a position to then take action, or so yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think it's and it's interesting, my first introduction to coaching when I was working in corporate was through the GROW model.
Yes.
Yeah, really interesting, sort of having sort of my journey starting from there and now sort of being where I am now is really interesting. So maybe talk us through, like, I love the magic. I think, and again, I think what you've done is put a framework or an acronym around, but every part of the magic model, I can see how that links into what we do in a thinking environment, but it's different language and different ways. But for those people that haven't read the book, maybe just talk us through what that is.
Absolutely. So MAGIC is a 5-stage acronym. So it's MAGIC, and it stands for mirror, aspirations, goals, ideas, and commitments. And we sort of use the image of a bridge. So the coaching process starts with where you are now on the ground, and you've got this perhaps gap to where you might want to get to, but you might not know what that destination is yet. So the process starts with, let's hold up the mirror and let's think about where you are now. Let's think about what's going well for you. Let's think about where you're less happy or where things are going less well. Let's talk about what's important to you, what your values are, what your strengths are. And that's a whole self-awareness piece. And that in itself is so powerful, and people find it so useful to examine themselves. And that's around reflection and self-understanding. And then the aspirations is, okay, so if this is where you are now, just talk to us about where you'd like to be. And it might be, how would you like to feel? Have you got a dream or a vision or a for the future? And this is big picture. It's not specific. It might just be, sometimes people say, I'd like to work for myself, or I'd like to feel more confident, or I would like to live in another country. It might be something as general as that, whatever the theme is that we're working around. And we spend some time, and sometimes we do a vision board or a mood board or a personal aspiration vision statement. And mine was, I want to be a published author. I want to And that was my aspiration statement. I didn't put any dates around it, any specifics. I want to write a book about coaching was my aspiration statement. And then if you think about the bridge, the mirror is the ground, the aspirations, you start to climb the bridge. And then the goals piece, as you said, comes quite a long way down that process. And the goals, if you think about the bridge, the goal is at the top. So when you start to say, okay, so you want to be a published author, tell me a bit more about that. Have you got any timelines around that, or any specifics? What sort of thing do you want to publish? And when you're at the top of the bridge, you've got the best view. You can see back to where you've come from, and you can see forward to where you want to get to. And so you've got that sort of 360 view, and you're ready to start putting some specifics around your goal, because you've done that work. The mirror and the aspiration is the key, because if we don't get that right, people will set the wrong goal and then the plan will be wrong. So once you get to this stage, you're really moving, and it almost takes care of itself from then on. So the goal, and then the next bit is the ideas. So, okay, so talk to me about how you might make that happen. What ideas do you have? Who could help you? Who could support you? How might you overcome obstacles? And so that's a sort of widening up your thinking, potential ideas. We evaluate some of the ideas, and then the commitments, you're back down, you're on solid ground. Right, okay, what's your plan? What are you going to do? Let's put some specifics around that. What's the first thing you're going to do to get you started? And that's really inspirational. And that tends, if you spent the time on the mirror and the aspirations, then the commitments are really genuine, because you've gone through that whole process.
And what I loved, Rosie, as well, is when you talk about it, I know I love the analogy of the bridge. I think it's really helpful, like the arc. But it's that actually that even that framework is offered in a very generative and generous way. Like it's not got solid, you've got to do this. It's like actually you sort of say, well, actually you might spend loads of sessions on the mirror, and then you might spend another, and then and it's like there's a real fluidity to it that I think with any framework can often sometimes get lost, which is like, well, it ends up becoming rigid, doesn't it? And I think when I was reading the book is like, it's like you offer it, but actually there's a lot of fluidity and responsiveness in that. So as you said, you might have one session where you do all of those stages, and your coachee is just, they're away, and then others you might spend months with one, or lots of sessions with one thing. I thought, and again, I think that really resonates with what I see in the work I do, is that some themes or some challenges are there for lots of sessions, so they'll keep appearing. And I just love this analogy of, it's like actually it's really hard for people to get to goals when they haven't spent time doing those first things. But yeah, I think it's really I really appreciated that sort of fluidity that you offer with it.
Yeah, thank you. I shared it with a friend, and he's one of these people that's always had loads of dreams. He's going to do this and he's going to do that, and it never quite happens. But he's always full of enthusiasm. Every time you see him, he's got another fantastic plan. And he read the book, right? And he said, do you know what? I realized, he said, I've always had dreams, but I've never had a plan. And he'd never followed it up with anything. And he said, it's a light bulb moment for me. He said, because I realized why I get disappointed, because I've had these thoughts, but I've never followed it through. And I've never sort of thought, okay, what do I need to do to make that happen? And he'd never done the self-evaluation. He'd just done the aspirations piece, and he realized, but he hadn't done any of the other bits around it. And he went away, said, you've really given me something to think about. And that wasn't a coaching session. It was just a couple of questions. And it was just something that made him go, oh, okay, right, okay, I'm going to have to go away and think about that. And that was the power of just a couple of questions around giving him some clarity, or helping him find some clarity.
Yeah, and I think that really comes through in the book as well, Rosie, that it's again, you don't do thinking environment. That's not your thing, but it's like all of these questions and the framework are all designed to help people think.
Yes. Yeah.
And so, although it might be like, from my perspective, there's more direction and there's more than I might offer, actually it's like they're all designed to be about the coachee. And again, which I think that's what we do. So it's I just think there's so much crossover. Like I look at the mirror and I think about, from a thinking environment perspective, our first questions are like, what would you like to think about? And
Yes.
what are your thoughts? And actually, what you find is what people effectively do is work out where they are.
Yeah. Yeah.
There'll almost be a form of looking backwards, looking forwards, working out how they're feeling, doing all of that. And then we might, the aspirations piece is working out like, well, why haven't I done that? And a lot of the time people will do that
Yeah.
given the right conditions.
Yes.
But I think there's something lovely about and there's a way of taking people if they don't get there themselves.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Um, and same with the goals. It's like we ask people what they would most like to accomplish, and very similar to you, we don't ask that straight away. And then the ideas, I think even as soon as you've articulated a goal, if you've done those first two stages, you tend to have better ideas instantly
Yeah.
because otherwise we've just been ruminating, or like your friend, like we haven't got past the aspirations.
Yes.
We haven't got, and I think there's, and so I love that actually. I think there is such commonality because I think it's also that's how people. I think given the right, whether it's a coaching conversation or they're with someone where they feel safe, like I always think that's how people do think.
Yes.
Like it's like we both put frameworks or ways to explain that, but actually it feels quite natural. It doesn't feel like it's something you've imposed on. It's like
Yes.
you've noticed it enough times to go, I think this is replicable.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
It's
That's
made
right.
something up that you're then imposing.
Yes. And I think what the feedback that we've had is that it feels like a natural flow of a conversation. So it's very natural when you first start coaching to say, how are you? What's going on for you? Tell me about how your week's been. Tell me about how you're feeling. And so actually the mirror is a very natural start to any conversation, because you would say, how are you? What's going on for you at the moment? And that is a very natural, as opposed to, right, tell me what you want to achieve. That feels sometimes it works brilliantly, but sometimes it feels like a jolt, and people are like, oh, okay. But actually, just to say, how are you? Tell me about what's on your mind. That leads into, okay, so if that's how you're feeling, how would you like to feel? Or if that's what's happening, how do you want to change that? And that leads into the aspiration. So it does feel like a natural flow of a coaching conversation.
And I'm really interested in so silence obviously features as a piece in your work, and it's a huge part of what people would experience in a thinking environment. So um we listen not only when people are talking or articulating, but we also listen through the pauses, because we found, as you have, that often in those pauses, that's where they're generating their next thoughts or their next feelings. So they're kind of going inwards. So yeah, I'm just really interested in your take on silence and the role that plays in the work you do.
Yeah. And one of the sort of light bulb moments for me when thinking about silence was, it's hard to stop interrupting people. People do find that's one of the things that we see is people interrupting. And so we learn to let people finish their sentences, but then also that we can, it's evident when you're interrupting somebody's talking, but actually in the silence, we need to be careful not to interrupt their thinking as well. And that concept was a fantastic light bulb for me, that actually it's not just around waiting for them to finish and then your next question or your next observation, but actually noticing when they're thinking and holding that silence to allow them to finish their thought as well as finishing their sentence. And I think that's where the silence comes in for me. One of the ways it comes in really powerfully.
Yeah, and I find this really interesting on my courses, and that for me there's like a silence like silence is so busy, like it's so rich and full of thoughts, which is so different to a silence which is like, oh, I'm done. And actually they're almost like two different things. Like someone's body language is different, the sort of the felt sense between you is different. Like when someone's thinking, like it doesn't have words, obviously because it's silent, but it's so rich and full for me. And I think that's one of the things that people kind of experience, is that they're like, oh, yeah, why would I interrupt that? But I think it's until you have experienced it, both as being on the receiving end of someone listening through your silences, um, but also to then, I think, step into that, like, actually you are interrupting something.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that that's fascinating, and people find that difficult because silence can feel, there's that difference that you're describing between the thinking silence and the silence I finished. But often people will interpret it as an awkward silence if they're not confident that enough. And we don't have silence a lot. We're busy, we're rushing around, life is noisy, but also when there is a silence, people are like, oh, I better fill it. So actually it takes quite a lot of confidence in a way to be able to hold that silence. And that's one of the things that people find it hard to learn, I think, when they're developing as a coach often.
Yeah, I'm interested in that. Why do you think that is? Like, why do you think we find it so hard to sit? Because it's interesting, isn't it, to equate confidence with being able to hold a silence? Like, you're like, what? Yeah, I'm really interested. Why do you think that um, have we forgotten, or why do you think we have that sense of needing to fill it?
Yeah. I don't know, but I certainly think it's very evident. And is it a sort of a cultural thing that we fear being rude if we don't have something to say? Is it that people think we've run out of things to say? Sometimes I think the coaches, certainly the new coaches that we work with, will think, well, it's my job to ask questions. And if I don't ask a question, will they think I don't know what I'm doing? Or will they think I can't think of a question? And they're so busy thinking about the right question that I think that can sometimes get in the way of just stopping and feeling the power of the silence, because they're understandably thinking about what's going on in their own heads, and it takes quite a lot of experience and to turn down that dial and just really be present in the conversation and turn down your own internal chatter. I think you need to obviously be aware of what we're noticing. We need to be aware of what we're hearing, but turning down the dial of some of the other thoughts that might be distracting.
Yeah, I love that, because it's almost like, if I, as the coach, am assuming that I'm responsible for what they're thinking and I can't hear what they're thinking, I'm there, like, I'm a bit lost, aren't I? Whereas if, yeah, it's a very different. And I do think we're socialized to interrupt. I think it's, I see even in, like, my children's school, that there isn't much space. There's not much space for introspection or reflection. And I think even when we're, say, I was as a coach, I think often coachees feel they have to fill the space. And actually the process of talking things out, that I think it's both ways. So I think if I'm coming to a session as a coach, assuming I've got to do and say to add value, and I'm also then, if I was coming with a coachee who felt like they had to prove to me that they were thinking in how they were speaking, you can have these almost interlocking assumptions that make it quite hard for both parties maybe to be comfortable with silence. And it's interesting because I've done sessions with people, and on one of my courses we do sort of teaching where somebody would be doing almost like a coaching session, and then there's people observing, and what people generally observe is like, goodness, there's a lot of silence, and I would want to fill that. And then you ask the person who was thinking, like, how did you experience the silence? And they're like, there wasn't any silence, because for them, they're still busy. Then they don't see it as an absence.
Yeah.
Whereas I think sometimes we see it as an absence of something. And
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting to reflect on, actually, what is the silence presencing?
That's really interesting, isn't it? And I think I've been writing some articles around the book recently about just the power of reflective silence, and it's been really resonating with people. And I've just written an article about just ourselves taking time to be silent. And I found some research, NHS research, that said even 5 minutes a day of just sitting and reflecting in silence for ourselves on our own can boost our well-being. Just 5 minutes. And I think so. Everything that we're saying, if you take that even out of a coaching environment, just to ourselves, if we have 5 minutes, we'll pick up our phones, we'll look at something. So we fill that space ourselves. There's something around being busy, being equated with being productive. And sometimes it's like, who's the busiest? I'm busy doing this and I'm busy doing that. And actually it becomes, I feel valued if I've got lots to do and I'm demonstrating, that I'm adding value. And just to be able to stop ourselves and be silent ourselves, I think is very powerful. And we don't do that very often either.
Yeah, and I love that because it reminds me, it's like we we ultimately coach who we are, don't we? So we can only be the kind of coach that we are as a person, and it's interesting if we can't have any silence in our own lives. Yeah. It's then I think really hard to then feel confident and at ease with silence in a session.
Yeah, so I think there probably is a link there, and even just pottering around the garden, going for a walk, driving. Sometimes I just love having, no music, no podcast, nothing, just listening to the sounds around. And I find that really reinvigorating, but it's very easy to think, oh, I'll just make a phone call, or I'll just listen to this podcast, or I'll put some music on. And that's lovely. But actually, sometimes just to sit and be is really powerful.
Yeah, and I remember listening to a talk last year, and the lady was saying, like, how often do we actually just do anything, like one thing at a time? So now it's like when I go running, I'm generally listening to a podcast, or if I'm doing the kitchen, the cooking, I've got the radio on. But actually, it's and this lady's point was like, actually, it's those spaces that we actually are kind of processing and taking into ourselves what we've learned elsewhere. And yet we're kind of so cramming in all this knowledge and information that there's no space for it to settle. But I wondered why coaching is so needed.
Yes, yeah,
because actually, it's like these protected spaces where we can be silent.
Yeah, you find sometimes when you're coaching somebody, perhaps in an organizational environment, and we've got maybe an hour with them or whatever period of time, and they really value just having that time without any interruptions, no meetings, turning their phones off, and just having an hour. And they say, oh, it's just so lovely just to have the hour to concentrate on one issue, or just to talk, or just to stop and think. And I think that's one of the powers of the coaching, is protecting that time, creating that environment for people where they're not interrupted by anything else. And people seem to really value that, certainly in my experience.
Yeah, I often start my coaching and my courses with a couple of minutes of silence.
Do you?
And often people are like, that was worth it just for that, because it's so rare. But I love, again, like you actually almost created an acronym for silence.
Yes.
Which when I was reading it, I was almost like, because we sort of say the word, don't we, silence. And actually, I think what you've done when you've broken it down is almost given it an anatomy. So it's like, what is it in that silence? I think it's so helpful, because it's not an absence of doing. It's like it might not look very active, but actually there's quite a lot that goes into being silent. So I just wanted you could share that, because I think I found it really helpful.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I thought about this a lot when I was thinking about the different types of silence and what's the silence that we find most helpful. So how can we as coaches create the silence that really adds value? So yeah, it's the SILENCE acronym. I love an acronym just as a sort of aid memoir, and it really focused my thinking. So the S is for slow down. So don't rush the process, create space and time. So that the slowing down is, I think, integral to creating that silence. The I is for introspection. So the idea is to create opportunities, sometimes rare opportunities, for reflective thought. So the introspection. The L is for listen. And that's listening to what people are really saying, but also listening to what they're not saying, and perhaps listening to what their body language is saying as well. So really, really listening to what people are saying. The E is for empathy. So understanding other people's perspectives, putting yourself in their shoes, and that empathy with that non-judgmental. So I'm listening in a non-judgmental way, and I have empathy for your point of view and for what you're saying. The N is for notice. So it's about paying attention. How are we reacting to what the coachee or the client is saying? What the body language is saying. So just notice their own tone of voice and what's that telling us. The C is for calm, and creating a calm and a supportive environment so that people feel safe, so that they feel they themselves can calm down and slow down. And the E is for engage, and that's for us to really remember about minimizing distractions. And interestingly, in the book, I put minimize external distractions, but actually I think now I take out the external, and it's just all distractions. It's internal distractions for us as well as external distractions. So there's something around turning off our notifications, something as simple as that, finding a place that we won't be interrupted, but also then putting away things that might distract us internally, so that we're really fully present, so that we can do everything else in that silence acronym.
Yeah, and I think there's so much in there that it's like, actually, because often in coaching or in thinking sessions, we don't know what we're going to think,
Yes.
because we haven't thought it yet. And so there is always a sort of a sense of vulnerability. Like, I don't know where I'm going to go. And I think if we sense in any way that we are judged, or the person doesn't feel present to us, or they do feel slightly distracted, or they as they come back to look at you just to do a quick check-in, if you look bored or frustrated, or people just respond. They just respond instantly, and they'll, depending on who they are, they'll either close down or they'll try and get your approval, or and so I think it's so simple, doesn't it? Like, even each one of those, Rosie, is actually, I think it really asks us to think about who we are as a coach. And because any one of these, even just take the N of notice. So being able to have that ability to notice my internal response and not react to it takes a lot of work. Because naturally we just respond. Someone says something, we respond, and it's like, but that's not what we do in coaching. But I think, so I just think that it's so helpful. And again, it's like, we don't think well if we're not calm. And so if we can sense from our coach a lack of ease or a lack of calmness, that there's a sense of urgency, that will create a kind of, not even a stress response is too strong a word, but it creates urgency then in our clients.
And I think there's something for us when we are creating and holding that silence of how we are in our being and our behavior, that helps that the client or the coachee feel reassured that it is a silence that's helpful and supportive. So sometimes if I'm holding that silence and I look and I'll give somebody a smile, a sort of an encouraging smile, as in, I'm here with you, and giving that eye contact and using our body language and our communication to sort of reassure, but maybe challenge a little bit, but I'm with you here, as opposed to, this is not an awkward silence. This is a deliberate, helpful silence. And I think there's a lot we can do just with our being to reassure that it's okay to sit in that silence, because we're not used to it.
Yeah, no, I think so much of that is done non-verbally.
Yeah.
It's like you just say, it's just a slight movement of your body or a smile, or you just shift slightly. And I think I know, like, people who come into coaching it's like they're so fixated on what they've got to do. And it's almost like this sense of, like, this way of being with each other, which actually I think we have almost a sensory feel for. Like, if I'm going to feel safe with you, if I'm going to feel it's okay to be vulnerable with you, actually that takes precedence. But I think often when people are beginning, they're so worried about what they're doing that they almost minimize this piece. And so I love the way it's like, actually, just in that, if people just remembered from this conversation, that's that acronym for silence, and it's like, oh, actually, there's a way of being within that that's so helpful to anything you're going to ask or do.
Yes. Yeah. One of the exercises we do on our coaching training is an exercise where we say, think about the best coach you've ever known, the best coach you've ever come across, or if you've had the good fortune to be coached by somebody really, really that you thought was really a great coach, and just try and sum them up in one word. And if you've got, and we do post-it notes or virtual post-it notes, and we just say, just just capture in a word or 2 or 3 words, what is it about that person that you think makes them such an effective coach? And then we draw a triangle, and on the triangle we put knowledge, skills, and sort of behavior. And we sort of say, so this is about the knowing. Was it that they were very knowledgeable? Was it that they were very skilled and they had these tangible skills of questioning or managing time and being organized? Or was it more about just their being, how they showed up, how you felt in their presence? And we describe the 3, and then we say to people, okay, so look at what you've written on the post-it notes, and where do they fit on the triangle? So have you written about their knowledge? Is it that they've read a lot of books and they're able to quote lots of references? Is it that they're very skilled technically as a coach? Or is it more about how they show up and their presence and their being? And we've done this so many times in so many different environments. And you won't be surprised that the being is far and away the biggest element of the triangle. And people have written it down independently. They haven't talked to anybody else about it, but they've all agreed that being is far and away what made the biggest difference when they were thinking about the most effective coach they'd worked with. It's a really powerful exercise.
Oh, I love that, Rosie. And I think in some ways, as a beginner coach, that can feel terrifying, because the knowledge of the skills are things I can hold on to. They give me certainty and they make me feel like I've got a sense of control. And actually, I think that's such a beautiful reminder that actually without the being, that's not what people remember. And it reminds me of that lovely Maya Angelou quote, which is I think I'll get this right, which is people don't remember what you say, and they don't remember what you do, but they remember how you make them feel.
Yeah, and we use that quote. That is exactly that's brilliant. Yeah, we're on the same thinking the same way, and we use that to sum it up. And we say to people, so this is you obviously need the knowledge, of course you do, because you need to know what you're doing. You need to keep up with what's happening in the field. You need to keep your knowledge up to date. Of course you do. And of course you need those core coaching skills. Of course you do. We're not saying the being on its own, because otherwise you'll be a lovely person, but you wouldn't have a clue what you were doing. So you need all 3. But we talked about the best coach, the coach that stood out from the rest. So that the knowledge and skills will get you your qualification, which you need, but your success will come from developing this being. And we say to people in the room, you're all different. You'll all do this differently, and that's okay. Be your authentic self. Do it in a way that works for you, and that will work for the right clients for you. So you need the knowledge, you need the skills. They're your solid ground. But what will make the biggest difference, the impact, is this being, and we'll all do that differently. And then when you don't have these attributes in the silence acronym, when you're not calm, and if you don't notice things, if you're distracted, if you're not engaged, what happens is the bit that disappears is the being. You still have the knowledge and skills, but actually, if I'm not calm myself, so if I'm not in the right place, if I've rushed in and I'm a bit flustered, or I've got other things going on for me, I'm not engaged, then that being is the one that disappears when I'm not in the right place. So you need that being in order to be able to demonstrate and create that environment for silence. So they link in together really nicely.
I do. Oh, I'm so pleased we talked about that. Oh, and so the book is made up of, is it 16 questions? Is it 16 or 12?
15 questions.
15.
It's 3 questions for the mirror, the aspiration. So 3 questions for each stage of the magic acronym.
Yeah, and so I wanted to talk about, obviously in coaching, I think we're all agreed, questions are good, aren't they? We like questions, and but I was just interested in your take. Why do you think that is? So why do you think questions help people reflect and think?
I think we need to be careful with the questions we do ask, because I think one of the things I remember reading a long time ago is the person asking the questions is the person steering the conversation. So the question that we ask will take the conversation in a certain way. So if we're not tuned in and we're not listening, we might ask a question that interrupts the thinking and takes it off in another way. So I think we need to be very careful as coaches that we are really listening, so that we ask a question that takes the thinking forward Because sometimes I see people thinking, you know, they think of another question and they haven't listened to the response, so they sort of go off in a tangent. So what I tried to do was get a flow of questions, and we say to people, this is a sort of a bit like a rudder for you, if you like, but it's not, don't stick to it. It's not a script, but it's to help you guide through the process. So the questions are there to help you think things through. And I think the value of a question for me is about stimulating thinking and taking thinking perhaps forward a little bit further. And that's where our partnership can help stimulate new thoughts and new thinking, and or reflect back what we're seeing, and help people look in the mirror and perhaps see something a bit more deeply. I'd be interested in your take.
Yeah, I remember years ago reading, I wish I'd grabbed the reference, that questions activate different parts of our brain than statements do. And so when we're asked a question, it stimulates almost like that search response in our minds. And so they do act like hooks. But I agree that I think, what we tend to do is we are almost asked the most simple question that then elicits with quite a lot of complexity. I think what you can ask the most simple question, and actually where that takes somebody in their thinking can be astonishing, and different for every single person. So for me, there's something about the purpose of a question is to really meet the need of the person in that moment, rather than meet the need of an agenda I might have. So I think it's really listening to what does this person need, and then is they'll then, as you say, develop their thinking or move forward, rather than like, I've got this really good question and I want to ask it. And again, I think, even when you say about, it's like you've got these questions, what you say so eloquently in the book is like they're not a sequence, and they're not to be asked in order, and it's like actually you learn them, but then they have a flow that they have a use at the time. But I think there is something in a question that invites us to think.
Yes, I think so too. And I think sometimes people, it's taking that thinking further. So there's definitely something around digging deeper, holding the mirror up, and helping people to stretch them, challenging them that little bit more. And that's where that then perhaps not doing themselves, because I think sometimes our own thinking can get quite tangled up and quite circular. And so what I sort of have this image of a sort of jumbled ball of wool, and sometimes what we're doing is we're straightening out for people, and just the process of articulating something. Sometimes, and I'm sure you've had this, people will say something and then they'll go, actually, I don't think that at all. I thought I did, but now I say it out loud, I don't think that. And you think, actually, that's really helpful. And they said, I've had this thought going round and round in my head, but it's in a circle. And now I've got it out and looked at it, I realise I think something different. And that's a thought I used to have, but actually, I no longer hold that view, or that's no longer serving me well. So I think part of the reason for me of a question is the thinking, but also the talking in terms of articulating something seems to also stimulate a different part of the brain. And when we explain and articulate it, that takes our thinking further.
Yeah, and I think actually in that process of articulating, often we're working out what we think. So we're giving voice to what feels most resonant or feels most important. But as you say, in that process of giving it a voice, it's helping us think through it. And I'm reminded of, we think at a far faster rate than we speak. And so I think that process of taking it from our minds to our voices is in itself a process of kind of synthesizing and clarifying for ourselves to work out, like, oh, is that? And often, when we're ruminating on things, we just think the same thoughts.
Yes.
So we just have the same, but we don't move it on. It's like we think about it for a bit, and then we get interrupted or we distract ourselves, and then we go back to that same thought. And actually, I think, a coaching space offers, once we've articulated it a few times, it's like, oh, okay, now what do I think?
Yes, yeah. And somebody explained well to me their thoughts recently, and she was saying, some people speak in order to think. So they think better when they're speaking out loud, and that's probably to do with somebody's learning style or somebody's communication style. And other people think to speak. So some people will think first, people more reflective will think first and then speak, but other people need to have that external stimulus in order to think more clearly, and they think better when they're speaking, and other people think better when they've had prior warning and they want to think it through before they articulate it. So I think there's something there about people's personal styles as well, and what works both best for us as individuals.
Mm. And I love you commented in the book about the difference between like why questions. I think you said a what question can soften a why question. I
Yeah,
think I read that right.
yeah,
And I
yeah,
thought that was really interesting because in the work I do, we tend to generally ask what questions.
yeah,
So what would you like to think about? What more do you think or feel or want to say? What do you think it's true? Um, and so it's interesting we've kind of got to the same point.
yes,
But I was just interested in why you got to that thinking.
yeah. Sometimes we've found if you're saying, why is that important to you? Which I think is, it's a good question. If you're talking about an aspiration or a goal, you might say to somebody, so why is that important? If we're not careful, it can feel a little bit challenging or a little bit like I'm disputing what you're saying. So why? Or somebody might say, well, this happened. And I might want to say, well, why did you do that? But obviously that sounds a bit accusatory, or it sounds a bit judgmental. So what we found is if I say to you, so what made you decide that as a course of action? It feels much softer and much more collaborative than why did you do that? Or what makes that important to you now? Sounds a little bit more partnering than why is that important to you? So I think it feels like can feel, especially if there's lots of them, can feel a little bit like an interview. I'm not interviewing you. I might be asking you lots of questions, but I'm not interviewing you. We're thinking together. And so I think sometimes we found that just changing the wording feels a little bit more collaborative than like an interview.
Yeah, and as you were saying that, it makes me think like if I was asked why, I feel like I have to justify and defend. It doesn't invite me to question
Yeah.
or to play.
Yes.
So I think it's yeah, I think the starting point feels different with those questions, definitely.
Yeah. But that may
Um,
be what you think it's helpful for somebody to question why they took a course of action or why they're choosing a particular goal. I think it's a useful question to ask, but I don't want you to feel that you're needing to justify the decision that you've made. It's more about, can you explore how does that link to your values, and how does that link to something else you said earlier, as opposed to why have you chosen that? So yeah, we've just found that seems to feel softer and more collaborative.
yeah. And it's really, I think in both of our work we talk about like advice giving and how seductive it can feel to give advice and how hard it can be not to actually, you know. So I was just, yeah, I thought it'd be interesting, like why I'm now asking why, but what's your experience with, or how have you helped people move away from giving advice?
Yeah. And I love your choice of word of seductive, because I think it can be quite alluring. And I had a conversation this week with somebody who was thinking about becoming a coach and joining our coach accreditation program. And he said, I've got to stop telling people what to do. He said, I love telling people what to do. And he's in mid-50s. He's been working for 30, 35 years. He's got a wealth of experience and wants to share it. And I think we've learned a lot through our lives, and sometimes people struggle a little bit with, I get employed as a coach because of my skills and experience, and so I've worked in the travel industry, so I'm asked to coach a senior leader in the travel industry because I've got that skills and experience, and then I'm not allowed to use any of that skills experience because I'm not allowed to give any advice. And I think that can be one of the hardest things. And I love John Whitmore, so the father of modern coaching. One of my favorite quotes of his is, it's harder to give up instructing than it is to learn to coach. That's the hard bit. And I thought that was really insightful.
Yeah, and I mean, we often talk about like the coaching paradox of like you matter profoundly and you matter not at all. So you matter, your being, your skills, your knowledge, that matters profoundly, and also it doesn't,
Yeah.
because what matters most is the other person. And I think that can be is asking us to really question. I think, what does it mean to help someone?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And I think often we have conversations about wanting to fix it and wanting to help, but tangibly help, and also wanting to be a rescuer, wanting to make things better. And that I think partly it's because particularly newer coaches struggle to see the value that they're adding. And if I'm giving advice, I can clearly see the value I'm adding. And it's something, you know, I came to this through the route of training, and I'm sharing models and sharing ideas, and the value is quite tangible. And I think sometimes at the end of coaching, people can say, I'm not quite sure what I did there. Did I really add value? Because it feels a bit less tangible. I didn't give any advice. I didn't share any of my thoughts. So therefore, did I add value? And I think it's linked to that need for the coach to know that they've done a good job.
And isn't it? But it's like I ask on all of my courses, you know, like who is good at taking advice? Like, when was the last time you actually acted on some advice you were given? And people are like never, you know, and that's even when we ask for it. And I think there is something about like we know that ourselves, and yet it is still really alluring to think, but I've got this piece of information or I've got something, and thinking it will make a difference. And I often think it comes from a place of like we don't want other people to make the mistakes we've made, and we almost want to offer the shortcuts,
Yes.
but actually it doesn't appear that's how we learn. It doesn't appear, if it was that easy, none of us would ever do anything, you know, that wasn't good for us. Or so yeah, I think it's really interesting, but I think it's also really important that we reflect on, if it was as easy as giving advice and
Yes.
that would then change behavior, we'd have probably already done.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's
um,
a great question that you're asking, is who's good at taking advice. I think that's really powerful for people, because actually we don't like being told what to do.
and anyone who's got children, like we know this, you know, like that's not how children learn. You can tell them and tell them and tell them, but they still have to push the boundaries, and they still have to, they learn through experience. And I think we're the same as adults. We just wish it was different. I think it would be nice, wouldn't it? And I mean, the book is full of exercises and questions and practices. Was there one that you have has a particular place in your heart, Rosie, that you, if you could have that, which exercise do you have real fondness for?
It's a good question. I think my favorite exercise comes quite early in the book, and it's looking at the versions of yourself. So past you, present you, and future you. And I love that exercise. I find it very powerful. And what we ask people to do is, so think about your present, think about where you are now, and the situation that you find yourself in. And think about, you know, what's going well for you, what you like about your situation, what you're happy with, what you're proud of, your achievements that you're really proud of. And then think about things that perhaps aren't going so well, or things that you're not so happy or content with, and looking in that mirror. And then look back to your past self and think about some of the decisions that you made that have led you on the path to where you are today. And we have to be quite careful here, because we have to look back with compassion, self-compassion. We have to be kind to ourselves, because we've all made decisions that we thought, oh, I'm so pleased I did that. And we've all made decisions where we think, what was I thinking? Why did I do that? So we all have those moments. So it's not about regrets, and it's not about beating ourselves up. It's just looking at the path that's taken us to today. And that's, I think, very powerful to say we are where we are today because of decisions that we made in the past, and because of things that happened to us. And we can't always change what happens to us, but we can change how we respond. to what happens to us. So we look at the journey to where we are today, and then we say, okay, so let's talk about your aspirations. Let's talk about where you'd like to be in the future. Let's talk about perhaps some of the goals that you have. And then, okay, so given that how we got to here was a series of decisions that past you made, what can present you do to help the you of the future? So what decisions can you make now, and what actions can you take going forward that one day the you of the future will look back and thank the you of today? And it's quite an emotional exercise, actually. It does get people quite emotional, but it's very powerful. And for me, that's the essence of coaching. It's being a friend to your future self, and I love that phrase of I'm being a friend now to the me of the future, and I think that leads into what coaching is about. Is helping me think, what can I do now? How can I be now that will help me be the person I want to be and get to where I want to go to?
Yeah, and I mean, I love that exercise, and I think there's something, isn't there, about like coaching helps us consciously and intentionally choose the direction of travel of our lives rather than it just happening to us. And it's like, actually, we can have agency, and we do have choices, and even making no choices is a choice. But however hard it is, actually we can be more intentional, I think, and conscious with whatever limitations we've got, that move us in that direction.
Yeah, and so that for me, that is the essence of coaching. So if you understand that, then everything else, all the other exercises make sense, because that's the heart of it all. So I think once you understand that concept, then you understand the power of taking control and taking steps and being intentional, as you say. Did you have a favorite exercise?
I really liked that. I really liked that one. I was interested in, and that was my question. Like, what would a future self want you to stop doing or start doing now? I think, that's a really good question for all of us, isn't it?
Absolutely. And it's a difficult question to ask, but even sometimes when we go out for an exercise, or we meet a deadline that we don't want to meet or whatever, and we do something, I think we often say to ourselves, it just at home, like, come on, let's be a friend to our future self. Let's go out and exercise, or let's tidy up, or let's do that piece of work we don't want to do, because next week or next month or next year you will love yourself for making that effort now. It's a great mindset.
I think so many things, like what we want is the future self, but without the work. Like, even just a silly example, like at the moment I'm trying to learn piano, and I want to be really good at piano, and I'm rubbish at the moment because I'm a beginner. And actually, the only way to become that future self is to sit down and practice badly for quite a long time. And I think there's so many things that actually, but if I don't, so I've got this aspiration, but if I don't actually do something with it now, like I'll never get there. And so I think sometimes just acknowledging it still requires work, like it still requires, but I'm pointing myself in that direction.
Yeah.
So Rosie, was there anything else that we haven't touched on that feels important from the book? Like any important messages that so was there a question you wish I'd asked?
I don't think so. I've really enjoyed our conversation, and thank you. And I think you've asked me some really interesting questions for me, and it's really helped me think things through. I've really enjoyed our conversation. So no, I don't think there is. Thank you very much for your attention, and for really thinking about what I've said and what I've written, and really helping me think it through and giving me the opportunity to explain it.
Oh, it's been a joy, and I've really enjoyed the call. I mean, I really enjoyed the book, and I've really enjoyed the call, and I really appreciate your generosity from having a stranger randomly contact you on LinkedIn to then actually us being able to sit and have I've really enjoyed the conversation. And where can people find you, Lucy, if they would like to?
Yes, please connect with me on LinkedIn. So it's Rosie Nice. So my surname is Nice, as you can see. I really did marry Mr. Nice. So yeah, please connect with me on LinkedIn, Rosie Nice. Got a website which is magic-coaching.co.uk. So those are probably the two best ways to keep in touch. I do a little bit of social media, but not really. So mainly it's LinkedIn, and you can read a bit more about the website. The book is on Amazon. I also sell signed copies on the website, on my Magic-Coaching website, and it's also on Spotify, the audiobook. I spent 2 days in a studio recording the audiobook. So it's on most audiobook platforms. It's coming on Audible. They apparently take a bit longer than the others, but it's on Spotify and most of the other audiobook platforms as well. So.
And I would really recommend it. Like it's you know, on the surface, it's not a I just think on the surface it doesn't look like it would resonate with the thinking environment at all, and it absolutely does. And I think it'll be thought provoking for beginning coaches and more experienced practitioners. So I think it's a really well thought through book, which has definitely got so much to add. So thank you so much for your time, Rosie. It's been a joy.
Yeah, well, I've really enjoyed it, and thank you very much. It's been great talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.